Betrayal in the underworld is a death sentence. But when that betrayal comes from the woman you love and your own blood, the punishment is worse than death itself. This is the chilling story of how one of the most feared mafia bosses in the country uncovered a betrayal so deep, so unforgivable, that he didn't just kill his wife, he turned her into food for his bloodthirsty pit bulls. And the man she betrayed him with? His own father. This isn't just a crime, it's a legend in the making. Love and loyalty, two things that don't mix well in the world of crime. The deeper the trust, the deeper the betrayal. What happens when the person you build your empire with becomes the one who tears it down? Darius Caldwell had spent years earning his place at the top, feared and respected in equal measure. His wife, Sierra, was his prized possession, the woman who stood beside him through every war, every victory. And his father, Luther, was the man who raised him in the streets, the mentor who taught him everything he knew. But love, blood, and power are a dangerous mix. The moment Darius discovered the truth, he didn't just lose a wife, he lost his last shred of humanity. This story isn't just about infidelity, it's about the kind of betrayal that turns kings into monsters and leaves a trail of blood in its wake. Before we dive into this gruesome case, make sure you're locked in with us here at Real True Crime Stories. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another jaw-dropping crime story. And we want to hear from you. How far is too far when it comes to revenge? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's get into it. Darius Reaper Caldwell was not born into power, he took it. From the time he was old enough to throw a punch, he understood that fear was a currency more valuable than money. His father, Luther Caldwell, had once ruled the streets with the same ruthless efficiency, teaching him that in the underworld, survival belonged to those willing to get their hands the dirtiest. Darius learned young that power was never given, it was taken, piece by bloody piece. His rise to the top was not by accident. He started as a street enforcer, the kind of man who handled problems with a baseball bat in a cold, steady glare. By his early 20s, he was the man others feared, climbing the ranks through a mix of calculated violence and an unshakable code of loyalty. When the old boss was gunned down in a restaurant ambush, Darius stepped over his still-warm body and took his place at the head of the table. The streets whispered his name with respect and terror, Reaper. Because when Darius Caldwell came for you, there was only one outcome, death. His empire was built on blood and strategy, but it was his discipline that made him untouchable. He didn't tolerate weakness, betrayal, or reckless mistakes. His men feared him, but more importantly, they trusted him. Under his rule, the Caldwell syndicate flourished, expanding into drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and high-stakes extortion. He made enemies, but none dared to challenge him. He was a king, and kings didn't bow, they made others kneel. But if Darius had one soft spot, it was Luther. His father had stepped away from the game years ago, retiring into quiet luxury while his son took over the streets he once ruled. Darius respected Luther more than any man alive. He was his mentor, his blood, his guide through the cutthroat world of crime. If there was one person whose wisdom he valued above all else, it was his father. He believed that above all, Luther was loyal. Then there was Sierra. His wife, his queen, the one person who could make him smile in a world of constant war. From the outside, they were the ultimate power couple, Darius, the untouchable crime boss, and Sierra, the stunning, poised woman who stood by his side through every battle. She was the perfect mafia wife, beautiful, supportive, and just distant enough from the business to keep her hands clean. She was the woman every man wanted and the woman only Darius could have. But Sierra was more than just a trophy. She was sharp, mysterious, and knew how to play her role to perfection. She attended the charity galas, dressed in diamonds and silk, smiling for the cameras as if she wasn't married to a man whose hands were stained with blood. She whispered reassurances in his ear at night, telling him that he was unstoppable, that she would always be by his side. Darius believed her. And that was his first mistake. Because behind closed doors, Sierra was hiding a secret that could shatter everything. A betrayal so deep, so twisted, that when it came to light, it wouldn't just cost her life, it would turn Darius Caldwell into something worse than a killer. It would turn him into a monster. Sierra Caldwell had spent years perfecting the art of deception. She was a woman who knew how to move in silence, how to keep her secrets locked behind a perfect smile. From the outside, she had everything: power, luxury, and the love of one of the most feared men in the city. But beneath the surface, she was drowning. Darius's love was suffocating, possessive, and absolute. He ruled his empire with an iron fist, and Sierra? She was just another part of his kingdom, his most prized possession, but a possession nonetheless. It started as something neither of them meant to happen. Luther Caldwell was nothing like his son. Where Darius was rigid, calculated, and cold, Luther was charming, experienced, and knew exactly how to make a woman feel like she was the only person in the world. He had once been the king of the streets, but now, in his retirement, he had traded bullets for expensive whiskey and quiet indulgence. He had seen the way Sierra looked at him, curious, maybe even admiring. And one night, in a moment that neither of them could take back, the line between father-in-law and forbidden lover was crossed. The affair was dangerous. It was reckless. And that was what made it impossible to stop. Every stolen moment was a gamble. Luther and Sierra met in secret, using the shadows of the empire Darius built to hide their sins. Hotel rooms booked under fake names, hurried encounters in the back of luxury cars, whispered conversations over burner phones. The risk only made it more intoxicating. Luther knew it was wrong. Sierra knew it was suicide. But the thrill of betraying the most powerful man in the city made them both feel invincible. Darius, for all his power, was not a man who ignored details. At first, it was just a feeling. Sierra had become different. Her touch was more distant, her late-night outings more frequent, her excuses weaker. The woman who had once clung to his every word now seemed preoccupied, as if her mind was somewhere, or with someone else. But Darius was no fool. The first real crack came when one of his most trusted men pulled him aside after a night at one of their clubs. The enforcer hesitated before speaking, knowing the weight of what he was about to say. "Boss. I saw something. You ain't gonna like it." Darius's stomach tightened. He wasn't a man who entertained paranoia, but if someone had come to him with this, it meant there was something worth listening to. "Sierra," the enforcer continued. "She's been seen with someone else." For a brief moment, Darius felt nothing. He had spent his life eliminating threats, ensuring his control was absolute. His first thought was that whoever Sierra had been seen with was already dead, they just didn't know it yet. "Who?" Darius asked, his voice cold, measured. The enforcer shifted uncomfortably. "We don't know yet. But we'll find out." Darius nodded, forcing himself to remain calm. If Sierra was cheating, it wasn't just a betrayal, it was disrespect. And in his world, disrespect was paid for in blood. At first, he assumed it was a nobody. A bodyguard, maybe a club manager, some idiot who didn't understand that touching Sierra Caldwell was a death sentence. But Darius was patient. He waited, he watched, and when the moment was right, he had his men dig deeper. The truth hit him like a bullet to the chest. It wasn't just any man. It was Luther. His own father. Darius felt something he hadn't felt in years, rage so consuming it made his vision blur. This wasn't just betrayal. This wasn't just an affair. This was humiliation. His wife, the woman he had given everything, had chosen his own blood over him. His father, the man he had worshipped, had crossed a line so deep there was no coming back from it. In that moment, something inside Darius broke. There was no fixing this. No warning. No second chances. Sierra Caldwell had just sealed her fate. Sierra Caldwell had no idea that tonight would be the last night of her life. When Darius called her, his voice had been calm, too calm. He told her he wanted to talk, that he had been thinking, that maybe they could work through things. He spoke in a way that made her believe he was vulnerable, that he was willing to forgive. And that was the cruelest part of all. Because as she slipped into her sleek black dress, as she touched up her makeup and rehearsed her apologies in the mirror, she actually thought she had a chance to fix this. She had no idea that the man she had betrayed had already sentenced her to death. The drive to Darius's private estate was long, cutting through miles of desolate land. The place had always unsettled her, the way it sat hidden in the woods, isolated from the world. Darius had built it to be his sanctuary, his safe haven. But tonight, it felt different. The air was thick, suffocating. The closer she got, the more her stomach twisted. By the time she pulled up to the wrought iron gates, an uneasy feeling had settled deep in her chest. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement, and took in the eerie stillness around her. No music. No laughter. Just silence. The estate was too quiet, too empty. Darius was waiting inside, sitting in his grand leather chair, a glass of bourbon in his hand. The fireplace crackled behind him, casting shadows that flickered across his face. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look hurt. He looked unreadable. "Sierra," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Have a seat." She hesitated but obeyed, lowering herself onto the couch across from him. The silence stretched between them like a noose tightening around her neck. "You look beautiful tonight," he mused, tilting his glass slightly. She forced a small smile. "Darius, I." He held up a hand, cutting her off. "Not yet." Something in his tone made her blood run cold. He set his glass down, leaned forward, and stared at her like he was looking straight through her soul. "You know what the worst part of betrayal is?" he asked, almost conversationally. "It's not the act itself. It's not even the lies. It's the fact that you made me look like a fool. That you thought I'd never find out." Sierra's throat tightened. "Darius, please, just listen." "I already listened," he said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the air. "I listened when I had you followed. I listened when I found the hotel receipts. I listened when I saw the texts. And you know what I heard, Sierra?" Her hands trembled in her lap. "Darius, I heard my own father whispering sweet little nothings to my wife." The room seemed to close in around her. Darius let out a humorless chuckle. "You really thought I wouldn't know?" He leaned back, shaking his head. "The man I worshipped. The woman I gave everything to. Both of you treating me like a goddamn joke." Tears welled up in Sierra's eyes. "It wasn't like that, I swear. I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," he said, his voice low, deadly. "And now, I'm gonna make sure you understand what real pain feels like." The shift happened so fast that Sierra barely had time to react. Darius stood, snapping his fingers. The double doors creaked open. And that's when she saw them. 6 massive pit bulls, their eyes gleaming under the dim light, their bodies coiled with hunger. They moved in unison, stepping forward with slow, measured movements. Sierra's breath caught in her throat. She knew these dogs. Darius had raised them since they were pups. But tonight, they weren't his pets. Tonight, they were his executioners. Her heart pounded. "Darius, don't do this. Please." He stepped closer, his face unreadable. "Dogs are loyal, Sierra. You weren't." She didn't get a chance to beg again. With one sharp motion, Darius pointed at her and uttered a single word. "Feast." The dogs lunged. The first bite ripped into her calf, yanking her to the floor. She screamed, a raw, gut-wrenching sound that echoed through the estate. Claws scraped against hardwood as the pack swarmed her, teeth sinking into flesh, tearing, shredding. "Darius," she shrieked, clawing at the floor, her body convulsing in agony. But he didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply watched. Blood splattered across the polished floors. The air filled with the sounds of flesh being torn, bones crunching, her screams turning into ragged, choking sobs. And then, nothing. Silence. Darius stood over what remained of the woman he had once called his wife. A twisted kind of justice had been served. But as he turned away from the carnage, stepping back toward his glass of bourbon, he realized something. The rage was gone. But the emptiness remained. Luther Caldwell had always been a man who feared nothing. He had built his empire on power, ruthlessness, and the unshakable belief that he was untouchable. But the day he received that package, something inside him shifted. It arrived in an unmarked black box, left at the foot of his estate's grand doors. The butler who retrieved it took one look at the name scrawled across the top, Luther Caldwell, and knew better than to open it himself. He carried it straight to the study, where Luther sat with a glass of cognac, unaware that the past was about to claw its way onto his desk. Luther's brow furrowed as he lifted the lid. Then, the stench hit him. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at what lay inside. Flesh. Hair. Blood-stained fabric. A woman's severed finger, the diamond ring still wrapped around the bone. Sierra's ring. Luther's stomach twisted, but his face remained stone cold. He reached into the box and lifted the folded note that rested on top of the remains. The message was written in a hand he knew well, his son's. "Blood kept you alive. Step out of line, and it won't save you again." Luther's grip tightened around the paper, his knuckles turning white. His mistress. His secret. The woman who had whispered his name in the dead of night. Now, she was nothing more than a brutal warning. The room was silent except for the soft crackling of the fireplace. The butler dared not move, waiting for orders. After a long moment, Luther inhaled deeply, set the note down, and took a slow sip of his drink. His face betrayed nothing, but inside, his mind was racing. He had spent decades ruling the streets with an iron fist, and now, his own blood had turned the game on him. There was a choice to be made. Retaliation meant war. A war that would shatter everything. Silence meant swallowing the humiliation of being outplayed. Luther had taught Darius everything. He had shaped him into the man he was. But he had never expected his son to be willing to cross this line. The news of Sierra's execution spread through the underworld like wildfire. Some whispered in hushed tones, saying Darius had lost control, that his fury had turned him reckless. Others, however, saw it differently. He didn't just kill her. He made a statement. That man has no limits. If he'd do this to his wife, what do you think he'd do to his enemies? Darius's power had been solidified, but with it came a new kind of fear. He was no longer just the mafia boss people respected, he was the one they feared crossing. But not everyone in the city was a criminal. Law enforcement had taken notice. This wasn't just a murder, it was an execution, a spectacle designed to send a message. And messages that loud didn't go unnoticed. The whispers turned into reports. The reports turned into interest. And soon, detectives were knocking on doors. Darius Caldwell had spent years solidifying his power, making himself untouchable. He had survived gang wars, assassination attempts, and betrayals from his enemies. But what he never anticipated was the knife that would come from within his own ranks. The streets talked, but law enforcement listened. Sierra's gruesome death wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. It was too bold, too loud. Her disappearance had been an open secret in the underworld, but when whispers reached the wrong ears, investigators began quietly piecing together the puzzle. At first, there was no hard evidence, just speculation and fear. But the real break in the case didn't come from the police. It came from one of Darius's own men. Marcus "Slim" Reynolds had been a soldier in Darius's empire for nearly a decade. He had seen bloodshed, handled dirty money, and stood on the front lines of war. But when the feds cornered him, dangling a deal that could spare him a life sentence, his loyalty shattered. Slim became the ultimate Judas. In a windowless interrogation room, he gave them everything they needed. The night of Sierra's execution. The pit bulls. The box sent to Luther. The threats. The quiet cleanup that followed. Darius had always known loyalty was fragile, but even he hadn't expected the betrayal to come this soon. Federal agents moved swiftly. In the dead of night, they raided his estate, surrounding the mansion with armed officers, spotlights cutting through the darkness. Darius, ever the composed kingpin, didn't fight. He stepped out onto his balcony in a crisp suit, cigar in hand, watching as agents swarmed his home. His face betrayed nothing, but he knew, this was the moment he had always prepared for. With a smirk, he flicked the cigar into the wind, letting the embers die before raising his hands. They cuffed him in front of his empire. The trial was a media circus. Prosecutors painted him as a remorseless killer, a man whose wrath knew no limits. The gruesome details were laid bare, how Sierra had begged for her life, how her screams had echoed through the estate, how her remains had been fed to his own dogs like garbage. The jury sat stone-faced, forced to listen to every chilling moment. But Darius Caldwell never wavered. Not when the prosecutors called him a monster. Not when his former allies testified against him. Not even when they read the verdict. Life without parole. The once untouchable kingpin was now just another inmate. But as he stood for his sentencing, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, he gave the courtroom one final statement. His voice was calm, steady, unshaken. Betrayal is worse than death. She got what she deserved. The gavel slammed. The legend of Darius Caldwell was over. Darius Caldwell had spent years building an empire, ensuring no one could challenge him. He ruled with an iron fist, demanding loyalty and respect. But in the end, the thing that unraveled his kingdom wasn't an enemy from the outside, it was a betrayal from the ones closest to him. He thought eliminating Sierra would restore his power, that making an example out of her would solidify his dominance. Instead, it set off a chain reaction that even he couldn't control. His rage blinded him, and in his quest for vengeance, he didn't see the cracks forming beneath his feet. His men turned on him. Law enforcement closed in. The same fear that made him powerful also made him vulnerable. Darius had everything: money, power, control. But one betrayal turned him into a monster. The irony? He destroyed his wife for cheating but lost everything in the process. The lesson? Power. And now, locked away for life, Darius Caldwell, once the most feared man in the city, had become just another cautionary tale. Was this a crime of passion, or was it the inevitable fate of a man who ruled with fear? What do you think? Was Darius justified in his revenge, or did he go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more jaw-dropping crime stories, subscribe to Real True Crime Stories. Until next time, stay safe, and stay alert.